In the year 1513, a Castilian named Vasco Núñez de Balboa was climbing the eastern spine of Panama, led by guides who knew every ridge and river of a country that no European had yet crossed. What he moved through was not the empty wilderness of later imagining, but a landscape alive with cleared fields, cooking smoke, and villages set within shouting distance of one another. His chronicles recorded chiefs who commanded thousands of followers, and gold worn as casually as another man might wear cloth. And everywhere along that crossing, Balboa's companions described the same thing: people, in numbers that later historians would struggle to reconcile with the silent jungle that replaced them. These were the peoples of the Cueva chiefdoms, one strand of a human world that had been woven across this isthmus for thousands of years. Ancient pottery shards, speakers of Chibchan and Chocó languages. Communities whose ancestors had begun practicing horticulture as early as 7,000 years before the Common Era. They had mastered ceramic technology by around 2500 BCE, earlier than most of North and Central America, and long before many of the cultures we more readily remember. This was not a scatter of wandering bands. It was a network of powerful chiefdoms, organized, hierarchical, and deeply rooted in the land they had shaped. Proof of how much had been lost surfaced almost by accident in the early 20th century, when the Rio Grande shifted its course and began washing gold artifacts out of the earth. The metal had lain buried for nearly 1,000 years, in a place that would come to be called Sitio Conte. When Harvard archaeologists excavated the site, they uncovered some 60 graves, roughly 1,000 gold ornaments, and layers of ceramic and stonework speaking of extraordinary craftsmanship. Skeletal remains of chiefs surrounded by companion burials and gold, burial pit, dramatic lighting. In one tomb lay a chief interred with a mountain of gold and 22 sacrificial companions, arranged around him in death as they had likely served him in life. And this was not an exception. It was a single window opened by chance onto a world that had once extended across the entire region. Vast, unbroken rainforest canopy, low sun, Darién, Panama. Some estimates place the pre-Columbian population of Panama as high as 2 million people, though we can never know the true figure with any certainty. Dense green canopy, no visible structures, mist rising. But if 2 million people once lived here, where did all of them live? And where are the marks they left behind? Forest floor beneath towering trees, tangled roots, deep shadow, no human trace visible. The answer, it turned out, was exactly where it had always been, beneath the canopy. The problem was never the absence of evidence. The problem was that no one had yet found a way to see through the trees. The Darién remains to this day the most archaeologically unmapped major landscape in the entire Western Hemisphere. Not because nothing lies beneath it, but because almost nothing can reach it. Access here is nearly impossible, the rainfall among the most extreme on Earth, and the canopy so dense that any survey conducted on foot advances at what can only be called a geological pace. For generations, that silence in the archaeological record was read as a kind of verdict, proof that the Darién had always been empty, marginal, a wilderness that history simply passed by. But that verdict was inherited, not observed. The Spanish who followed Balboa were not surveyors. They were extractors, and their records catalog gold and slaves in obsessive detail, while saying almost nothing about the field systems, the canals, or the trade routes that sustained the people they were dismantling. West of the isthmus lies the Chocó, a Pacific-facing corridor of forest so wet and so botanically extravagant that its plant diversity rivals almost anywhere on the planet. And until only recently, this place held almost no environmental data of any kind, because it had been judged too remote and too difficult to enter even for basic ecological fieldwork. So the silence held, layered first by disease and conquest, then by the quiet assumptions of everyone who came afterward. And then, near a place called Santa Cruz de Chinina in eastern Panama, the ground itself began to speak. 22 blocks of parallel agricultural banks and ditches, running across 30 hectares in ordered, deliberate lines. Radiocarbon dating placed the fields at roughly 13 centuries ago, Engineering, not accident, and certainly not the scattered leavings of wandering hunter-gatherers. Someone had planned this. Someone had shaped the water, raised the earth, and worked this land with an intelligence the colonial chronicles never bothered to record. One site found almost by accident in one corner of one country, and the questions it raises have driven researchers back into the field season after season ever since. The question that followed was always the same. If this was here, what else was hiding beneath the trees? And for decades, no one had any real way to answer it, until a technology arrived that could finally ask from the sky. The technology that arrived was called LIDAR, and it began not on the ground, but in the air, aboard aircraft flying slow, deliberate transects above the forest. From beneath the fuselage, the system fires a grid of infrared beams, hundreds of thousands of them every second, falling toward the trees like an invisible rain of light. Each beam finds the smallest gap in the leaves, travels down through the layered darkness, strikes the earth below, and returns carrying one precise measurement of distance. Multiply that single return by billions, and you are left with an enormous cloud of data points, a map of a ground that no human eye has ever clearly seen. Then comes the move that changes everything, when software strips away the forest itself, every trunk, every branch, every leaf, until only the naked surface of the land remains. And on that bare terrain, the shapes of human intention rise into view, straight lines where nature makes curves, flat platforms where slopes should be, geometric hollows that could only be canals or the boundaries of fields. Upano Valley LIDAR render, network of roads and mounds, Ecuador. This was never theory. In the Upano Valley of Ecuador, the data revealed an urban network of roads and mounds 2,500 years old. In the Llanos de Mojos of Bolivia, vast raised field systems surfaced in the point clouds, engineered landscapes that had been dismissed for generations as empty wetland. Across the Maya lowlands, the 2018 Pacunam survey alone added over 60,000 previously unrecorded structures in a single season. Not scattered outposts, but the dense connective tissue of a civilization whose true scale had been hiding in plain sight for a century of ground-level excavation. But here the story is often told wrongly. LIDAR does not discover lost cities by itself. He weared the clo, let the look at is confirm, amplify, and scale the work that local scholars, indigenous knowledge holders, and field archaeologists had been pointing toward for decades, accelerating understanding, never replacing the human knowledge that came first. Which brings us back to Panama, and to a number that should stop you in your tracks. More than 80,000 hectares of LIDAR data already collected across the Choco. It had been gathered for ecology, for biomass studies, for mapping the canopy, for measuring the living forest rather than what lay buried beneath it. The data already exists. It sits in archives waiting to be asked a different kind of question entirely. Somewhere in those tens of thousands of hectares of laser-mapped terrain, beneath a canopy that no colonial chronicle ever described and no field archaeologist has yet fully walked, the ground is waiting to be read. Slow push into dark forest interior, filtered light through leaves, sense of buried history. And here, before we go any further, honesty demands a pause, because the story of Panama's Choco is not yet a story with an ending. As of this telling, no peer-reviewed publication has confirmed a specific lost city rising out of the Choco's laser-mapped terrain. We cannot yet name what has been found because the work of naming it is still underway. But this is not a gap to be papered over with easy certainty. It is the truest part of the story, a discovery still arriving, still resolving into focus before our eyes. To understand what may be waiting in Panama, turn south to a valley in eastern Ecuador called the Upano. LIDAR revealed a 300-square-kilometer network, not a single ceremonial center, but a web of at least 15 interconnected settlement mounds, linked by straight causeways and separated by engineered drainage channels, dating to roughly 500 BCE and predating the classic Maya cities that usually anchor these comparisons. When the lead archaeologist, Stephen Rostein, first saw the shapes assemble in the data, he could barely speak. "Wow!" was all he could manage. And the parallel between that valley and the Darién is not a hopeful guess. It is structural, built on shared ecology, shared pre-Columbian complexity, and shared histories of colonial erasure. Both regions were wet, forested, and fully inhabited, and both were emptied and forgotten in the same brutal century of contact. If the pattern held in Ecuador, there is every reason to expect that the ground of the Darién is hiding something of its own kind. Those ridged fields near Santa Cruz de Chinina, that same deliberate geometry of banks and ditches we encountered earlier, shaped by hands that knew exactly what they were building, were found without any technology more sophisticated than boots and a machete. That vast, deliberate landscape was found without LIDAR at all, stumbled upon, almost by accident, in a single corner of a single country. So imagine what the laser might find, pointed systematically at that same country from the sky. The people who built these fields spoke only through what their hands pressed into the earth, and the Spanish who followed recorded gold weights and slave tallies, never the canal routes or the names of the engineers who dug them. The only voices these people have left are pressed into the shapes of the ground itself, and for 5 centuries, no one held a tool sensitive enough to hear those shapes speak. But now a new pressure closes in. And this time it is not disease that threatens what lies beneath. It is agriculture, logging, and infrastructure cutting into the canopy year by year. And when the trees go, the ruins go with them. The race between discovery and destruction is not a metaphor. The ruins are there, and the laser has already passed over them. And somewhere in a data archive, their shapes exist as columns of numbers, waiting for the question to be asked in precisely the right way. And when that question is finally answered, it will not only redraw the map of Panama, it will force a reckoning with how deep and how complex this region's human past really runs. Return for a moment to the world that Balboa walked through in the spring of 1513. The villages within shouting distance, the cleared fields, the smoke rising through the gaps in the leaves. It was a world in full, inhabited, ordered, alive with the ordinary business of thousands of human lives lived under the same sun that rises over the Darién today. And within a single human lifetime, almost all of it was gone. The sequence of erasure ran in a specific order, and that order is everything. The pathogens arrived first, the settlements emptied within decades, and only then did the canopy move in to cover what had been abandoned. The jungle was not the cause, but the consequence. Waves of disease spreading across Central America, red bloom over the isthmus. The killers were smallpox and the other pathogens carried in European blood, moving faster than any army, outrunning the conquistadors themselves into villages no Spaniard had yet seen. Populations that the earliest explorers had documented as thriving were, within a few short decades, scattered, broken, or simply extinct, emptied out into a silence the forest would inherit. What lies beneath the leaves now is not the decay of something primitive. It is the remains of something that worked, that was sophisticated, that was living, and then was not. That silence compounds across the record. No codices, no inscriptions, no king lists. None of the written architecture through which other peoples argued their way into history. Everything they knew of themselves, their histories, their myths, the names they gave the rivers they engineered and the fields they shaped, died with the generations that disease took first. The only records that survive are the ones pressed directly into the ground. The geometry of their ditches, the elevation of their platforms, the deliberate straightness of their roads. And this is what the laser gives back. Not the people who are gone beyond any recovery, but the shape of the world their hands made, restored out of the dark. The light does not return their voices, but it returns their footprint. And in a footprint, something of a person can still be read. So the render dissolves, and the city goes back under the trees where it has waited for 500 years. But we have seen it now, and we cannot unsee it. For 5 centuries, the forest held these ruins in the dark, not as an obstacle, but as a kind of custodian, keeping faith with the dead until someone arrived who knew how to ask. Ground level, standing at the edge of the jungle wall at dusk, shapes indistinct in the middle distance. Imagine standing there at dusk, at the edge of the Darién, the canopy wall rising ahead of you, and the shapes of unseen things settling into shadow beyond it. The forest still stands over it, roots threading through the walls, the canopy closing the sky above roads that once carried thousands. But the light has been there now. It has touched the ground, and the ground has answered.